Thanks for having us here in new corporate headquarters in Cambridge.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for coming.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah, great to see you here, Joe.
Now tell me about the facility, because I know one of the really cool things about CMR was where it was birthed.
Yeah.
So let's go through the history a little bit.
Yeah, so we started off in what is often called pig sheds, which we don't like to call them that, but they were actually feed barns up at the highest point of Cambridge, actually. And it was just a very small sort of R&D shop. And then we very quickly ran out of room. After about 3 years, we ran out of room. So we took on another place which we call Evolution Business Park, or EBP. We've run out of space already because we are growing at quite a phenomenal rate. And now we've put a commercial headquarter here on the Science Park in Cambridge. And I'm sure we'll run out of room again soon at some point. So yeah, so it's hard because you've got to have enough space to at least get a few years runway because it's quite distracting when you're moving businesses and business headquarters all the time. So yeah. Is
the engineering here? Do you have the brilliance sequestered somewhere else, and the ops are here?
Yeah. So we have a lot of the brilliance is still at the original Chrome Lee, but that's now all moving to the EBP park. And the engineering's all moved to one centre there so that the software engineers, the mechanical engineers, the designers can all be together in one building, which is critical. And that also has in there sort of the current manufacturing. And we're in the middle of building a huge facility about 15 miles from here in Ely. And we'll be able to do some pilot lines there as well. And I think that's really important. You've got the whole engineering team together, so that they can all talk to each other, because it's a system, right? A lot of people make the mistake thinking it's a collection of parts. It's not. It's a complete system. So yeah, great that they can all be together. We've got out of their way from the commercial side and moved over here.
Now you've done something relatively unique. You've almost doubled in size year over year from a head count and also delivery of systems, all through the pandemic.
Yes, that was a challenge. I think it was it was a tough time. It's not easy, but I think we had a great commitment from our chief medical officer, who set up a lot of COVID testing in factory. We had a lot of people who could work from home, which was great, and we got very quickly, being a digital company, you would hope that we can deal with the technology of being digital at home. So we were able to get the people that could work from home working at home, and that was fairly continuous. And then we were very protective of our manufacturing teams and our engineering teams in terms of doing lateral flow testing in and out of the building every single day. And it was just a great team effort, and a lot of sacrifice by people to actually keep that whole business going through COVID. But yeah, we came through it, and it was challenging but great.
And I asked that question because I don't want to necessarily focus on the pandemic. What I want to focus on is, it's very clear, at least from the outside world, that CMR, while it has intention to be a profitable, capitalist-driven organization, it's got a passion and fanaticism about it.
Yeah. I think that it's a mission-driven company, and I think that is really part of the reason why I'm here as well. We have the tagline, which is transforming surgery for good, and you can read that in a few different ways. And I think that the people that work here are really motivated and driven by, they want to get more people access to minimal access surgery, because they know that, well, the evidence shows minimal access surgery is better. So people are really driven, and they come to work every day thinking, first and foremost, how do I contribute to making sure that patients in this area, in the UK, in Europe, across the world, can get access to minimal access surgery? And the vector that we use for that is Versius. So it's a fairly well concentrated company on mission. And I think that's one of the things you feel as you walk around the company. You feel the mission.
You mentioned the word, we're a digital company. I hope we'd be able to pull that off. I've been watching for 20 years now, since the start of Intuitive, this pursuit of surgical robotics. Yeah. And the big strategics, and I would call it 3 big strategics that are pursuing robotics right now. No disrespect to CMR right now. You've got Intuitive, you've got J&J, and you've got Medtronic. Yeah. Now J&J have to play defense against billion-dollar franchises. Intuitive is the only digitally native strategic when it comes to surgical robotics versus the other two. Thank goodness for them, because we're standing on their shoulders of innovation, surgery, LAP, minimally invasive surgery, going back to the Ethicon US surgical days. But do you believe there's a competitive advantage, like CMR to be a digital native, like Intuitive to be a digital native when it comes to putting out a digital platform like this?
Yeah, I think it's, having been in medical device before and then come across to what I would call medtech or digital native, it's completely different. You have to have it in the DNA of the company, the team, and the product from day one. I think it's really hard to take a medtech company and try and convert it into a digital company, because you've just got a lot of legacy that you've got to deal with. Intuitive absolutely were based from a digital product from day one, and you see it, you feel it, and their product and their company exudes that. It's really quite admirable. And I think CMR's advantage, A, why we've been so fast, and B, why we've been able to be so focused, and you see a lot more coming of our digital ecosystem, is because we've not had to do a conversion. We've not had to do that digital conversion from being an analog company in everything that you do and trying to transpose that into a digital product, company, ecosystem. I think that's just difficult. And especially then if you end up straddling both, because what you can do, dump all of your analog products and your legacy products just to get onto your digital products. So I think that gives us a big advantage to have that laser focus into the digital ecosystem.
Is there also an advantage to being a privately held company? Because if I'm a publicly held company and I've got shareholders and I've got tens of billions of dollars a year in sale, I've got quarterly reports. And in order for me to sequester aside a couple $100 million for a long project, and again, CMR has really delivered relatively quickly, is there an advantage that CMR has or other private companies in this domain?
Yeah, and again, I've worked for some of the corporate organizations. I think it allows you a different mindset. It's not to say that you couldn't end up with investors that want to see a return in short term. I think we've been lucky that we've got investors that have had a 20-year playbook. That was one of the things that our investors said to us: tell us your vision for 20 years. And I think not having that that quarterly bounce that you have every quarter allows us to do things saying, you know what, this is just going to take us a year, but we can do it right over a year, and we've not got that pressure to deliver on the quarter. So I think that frees you up a little bit. I think the second thing that frees you up for being a private company is that we don't have to tell everyone what we're doing all the time. And I think that gives us a lot of advantages, because, like our press releases, we dictate when we want to put them out. We're not kind of under pressure to get press releases out and things like this. That gives us time also to get things right and then move on. We're not being told, right, keep moving, keep moving, keep moving. I think it's got a lot of advantages. We're not a big corporate, so we've got some disadvantages from that. But having lived in both worlds, I think for this kind of project in digital products, surgical robotics, I think being a privately owned company, the advantages weigh out the disadvantages.
So if you look at the surgical robotics world today, and it's very broad, and I'll ask you your definition of robotics in a moment, but if you look at the surgical robotics world right now, there's more than 200 companies in development of a surgical robotic platform. Out of those 200, 100 are in abdominal or thoracic. That's a lot.
Yep.
I think there's room for a number of players in that area. How did you get so far so fast?
So I think there's a couple of reasons why we got so. First of all, we were laser focused. We had the great fortune that our founders came together understanding really what they were trying to do. So if you look at Luke Hares, who's the CTO, he just really understood that the way that everyone was going after surgical robotics today just wasn't right. And he was trying to really understand fundamentally, if you build something from the ground up, what features, what form factor, what does it need to look like, smell like, and taste like to be a successful surgical soft tissue robot? So having that ultra focus meant you could really get the company to go in that one direction without going down too many branches and wasting a lot of time to get where he wanted to go. So I think that was one of them. The second was that we had investors with deep pockets who were willing to back us. I think if you have an investor who's in this to do a quick flip, I think you're going to struggle as a company, as a management team. We've just been very fortunate that we've had superb backers who've not really going after the profits, they're sharing the vision with us. And if you look at the company vision again, you can't just have the company having that vision and then your shareholders having a completely different vision. Those two things don't go together. So I think we've just been very, very fortunate that we've had investors that really understand it, investors that share the mission. We have a very clear mission and a very clear from the CTO how you deliver on that mission. And I think that's why we've been able to do this so quickly.
You talked about form factor, and there's many form factors right now in the soft tissue large format, and I'll call this a large format, right? Surgical robotic platform. Why this form factor? You know, we've all got the intuitive form factor when we think about surgical robotics. We've got the transenterics form factor. Both of those are relatively large form factors in reference to the Versius platform. So did you make this small to make it small, or did you develop this and it happened to allow it to be small?
Yeah, that's interesting. And again, that comes back to, it was just the insight of Luke. And the question was that he asked early back in the day when he was looking at this was, why isn't surgical robotics more widespread? And the immediate thing everyone says is cost. And I don't believe that. That's a piece of the equation, but it's not all of the equation. And part of it was that, you know, sometimes the bigger robots can't fit into the room. Or because they're bigger, they're more difficult to move from room to room. And Luke had a really good intuition, which was, well, surgeons seem to be able to move from room to room. Surgeons seem to be able to get into elevators. So surgeons seem to be able to reach everything that you need for laparoscopy or thoracoscopic work. So shouldn't the dimension of the arms be more or less human? It's like a human scale. So if you look at the arms, they're first of all, they are based on a human arm. They're not much bigger than a human arm, and they have a shoulder, an elbow, and a wrist. But if you look at the bases, they're 38 by 38 centimeters, which is more or less hip size. So that means they can get through doors, they can get through elevator doors, they can get around the table, just as surgeons in the surgical team get around the table. And the other thing that we had to do was get the weight down so that you can't have colossal weight that you have to use very specialist elevators or you need to reinforce the floor. Instead, we made the system so that it was human size, human weight, and with a human reach. So you would imagine if a surgeon can do it, then Versius can do it. So that was the design concept. Not easy to do, but that's what Luke had in his mind from day one. I want to make it so that you can replace the humans around the table with human size arms around the table. That was the thinking.
How do you get away with not needing as much mass? So when we look at the other robots that are cleared right now, let's just stay in the US, that are cleared in the US, they require an enormous amount of mass, meaning a footprint, beside being big for the sake of being big, it's inherent in the design as a requirement in order to surgically move inside the patient. How have you been able to smuggle this in?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's two pieces for mass. One is what it ends up being because of the size of the robot, and one is having the mass for stability. They're two slightly different things, and we've had to sort of come midway on both of them, and I'll explain a little bit of that. So most robots that are out there today, they kind of hold instruments with a mechanical Z rail. And what that means is that you're trying to move in a volume inside the patient. And to get that volume inside the patient, you have to move your arm outside the patient. And if you're holding an instrument like this, if I want to move the tip here, I move like this. But if I want to move it now here, I have to go all the way over. So I have to have a long, long reach. To make something a long reach, you need a big mechanical part. If you have a big mechanical part, it's heavy. So the next joint that hangs on has to be big and heavy. the next joint bigger, and it gets gradually bigger as you come back to the base. And then you have to have a mass of the base when you're hanging over to do those reaches. So what Luke realized was human beings don't seem to reach like that when they do surgery. And his insight was the wrist. And he worked out that humans can move their wrist rather than moving their elbow everywhere. So if you look at Vercius, again, he basically built a 4-axis wrist into the system. What does that mean? You've got lots of reach on a fairly small arm. You've got a small arm, it can be a lightweight arm. And that can go all the way back, so you end up with a smaller, and you don't need a big heavy base to hold the arm. The second piece of it is that you've got to think of each of these joints a bit like a unicycle, where they're continuously moving. So we're not getting the stability from the weight of the base. We're getting it through software. So about 5,000 times a second, the positions of the gearboxes inside, knowing where they are, and it's basically moving all the time. So the stability comes from the software and the way the mechanics is driven inside the arms. What that means is you can end up then with something really clever, which is collaborative robotics, and I can show you a little bit later that you can actually push on these arms. You don't care about the stability, because if the arm moves any of the joints, the software knows, and all the software works to move all the other joints to keep the tip stable in space, in 3D space. So that's how you get away from the mass for stability and the need for mass going backwards to the arm. So that's a little bit of genius of what Luke did, really.
When we think about making a robot like this, I mentioned there's 100 of the soft tissue on the thoracic abdominal side. And prototyping a robot is one thing.
Yep.
Getting through V&V, verification validation, is another.
Yep.
Now going commercial.
Yep.
This is my spitball, but I think it's $1 billion a year company at a minimum in order to start and compete with the platinum standard in the market today, Intuitive, right? Not just putting out a robot. You've got training, development, ongoing product development, software safety, et cetera. So it's not one and done. Is CMR going to be a digital company that is going to be able to support, how many systems do you have in the market right now, roughly?
Over 100.
Over 100. And so as we scale that to 1,000 to 5,000, are we prepared for that scale? Because if we continue with that hockey stick of development that you've demonstrated over the last few years, and the adoption and ongoing utilization of robotics, and you are now explaining that this has a higher accessibility capability, are we ready for that?
Yeah. So, well, we hope so. So, the key to that is, it's a little bit like and I'll use a very British way here of thinking like a soccer game. Okay.
Football, if we're here.
Football, yeah. Okay. I mean, I'll call it football, which is the real word for it. Different football in the US. But if you want to go and play against Liverpool, my team, or Manchester United, you've got to put 11 players on the pitch, right? You can't go out there and say, we'll put 5 players on the pitch and we'll have a go against Liverpool. You're not going to do that. So one of the important things that we did early on is get 11 players from day one. And part of we've basically doubled the size again this year of the company. And that's really been about making sure that we've got enough players for this phase of our growth. And that takes a lot of money. You need, as you say, the prof ed, you need the field service engineering teams, you need the teams back doing the R&D, you need commercial teams, you need all the support office people, you need the whole group. That's why we had to take a lot of money early on. It's not really to make the plastic and metal, that's not really the thing. It's really getting that entire support structure in there and building that human ecosystem around it to get it done. And I think that's where, yes, there's 100 companies out there. I wouldn't want to be in one of those companies if they weren't, raising $1 billion. It's just hard. We know, we've done it. So I think we definitely are scaling at the right speed. And now the income that's coming from the systems that we're selling is also fueling that as well. So I think we've primed the engine. I've been in startups a long time, and there's a lot of what I would call infant mortality in startups. Out in West Coast, there's probably 8 out of 10 used to go under probably don't know what the number is now, but it used to be 8 out of 10 when I was back out in the West Coast. I think we've gone over the infant mortality. I think we've crossed that bridge. You said it perfectly. Making a prototype and a great demonstrator is really, I don't want to say easy because that would be disingenuous to the brilliant engineers, but it's the easier part of what you have to do. Making 4 or 5 of them that all do the same thing is a bit harder. Getting them through V&V to prove they all do the same is even harder. But then when you go to serial production, that's like a next level. And I think where was our biggest risk of where we would have failed as a company was that leap from 5 to 10 V&V systems to get into a couple of hundred that you have to produce en masse. They're all the same, they all work the same. Not easy, but I think we bridged that chasm, we got over that, and now we've kind of learned the hard knocks. There was a lot of hard knocks, but I think we've got over the infant mortality. So now it's really just about scaling. And you know, we had a change of CEO to Per Vegard, who came in. I mean, that's a person who understands scaling. You know, he's from ABB Robotics, and he understands scaling. And the whole company has gone from an R&D house, now we've gone to a scale up. So I think we'll do okay.
And paying homage to Martin, who was one of the original pilots to get us to where we are now. So let's go down to form factor for a second. There's a debate going on right now in surgical robotics, especially on the soft tissue side, about single use versus reusable.
Yeah.
And there's some challenges there. There's performance challenges, there's sterilization challenges, but there's still economic challenges. Have you picked a camp to be in yet, or do you see it being a sort of multifactorial camp at times?
I think the ultimate answer is you're probably going to need a mix of both. The one thing that you learn with this is that you can do articulated instruments as single use, and you can do it fairly well. But it's a different level up to move to truly wristed instruments that are really trying to follow your hand movements in real time. The amount of precision that you need and the engineering that you need in the instrument it's another level up. And so far, we've not cracked the code. We've definitely not cracked the code on how you make that in a cheap enough way that you can make it a single use or a disposable product. Doesn't mean that we couldn't do that in the future. I think to keep the quality and precision that you need, and Intuitive have been brilliant at doing that, by the way. I think there's going to be reusability in a lot of the instruments. That doesn't mean that some of the instruments, especially electrosurgical instruments, couldn't be less use or single use. I think that, you know, back in the laparoscopic days when I was there, a lot of people used disposable scissors. Why? Not really to do with the mechanics changing, but the blades get dull. You get a lot of Eshar build-up on them. You end up with the performance of the blade not being as good as it can be. Maybe that's an area where a single-use product or a very limited life product might be the ideal thing. But getting that on a really compact wrist so that on your first use, even in a disposable, is exactly with the mechanics of where you want it to move. It's a challenge. It's not easy. And I think today, the right answer for us is to have a reusable system. That doesn't mean we wouldn't move to where it's the right instrument for the right application, a single-use instrument.
When you come to surgical robotics, especially a large format, discussion is expensive. Right? And we need to define expensive. Is that the price tag out of the gate, or is that the price per use? Because if I heard you right, that this system lends itself to be a lot more flexible, a lot more adaptive to other procedures, can move around and isn't anchored in a room. And so is there an argument to be made that I can get more procedures in per day, per month than other large format robots? So maybe I can charge the same price. And I don't know your price point right now, and I don't know if you want to share that here, but in a comparator, it can't be too far off the industry standard.
No, it's close to the industry standard. The way that we think about it, and again, clues in the name, Versius, which was about versatility, we understood very early on that if you've got, let's call it $1 million robot, just for round numbers. You've got $1 million robot. If that can just do one case, no matter how you do the economics, that one case is $1 million. If you do 1 million procedures, the case, at least the capital, comes down to $1. So it's all about volume. So again, why I think Versius was built the way it was. First of all, we're born out of Europe, okay, and there's economic challenges within the healthcare system here. Even in the US though now, there's economic challenges. We were trying to make sure that Versius could be used from 7 in the morning till 7 at night. And you could use it in multiple cases. And we realized pretty early on that unless you have a Versius in every OR, which then means you've got to buy lots of Versius, you've got to be able to make this thing move. So the entire design of why it was so, it's large, but it's the smallest of the large ones, if that makes sense. It needs to be able to be moved very easily between ORs. So if you've got a urologist with 2 robotics cases in a day, and you've got a gynecologist that could do another 2 robotics cases, but it's stuck in the OR, you've already lost half of your leverage, right? So we've made it so that you can, as you're finishing up a case, you can start moving the system next door so the gynecologist can start on the case, and then you can move it back, and you get that flow and movement so the robot doesn't get in the way of the OR's workflow. What we try and do is slot into the workflow and therefore get utility. We did a test in, it was Max Hospital and it was Suet Hospital, and we basically asked them to just go as hard as they could. And you know, in 17 days, Professor Chaubey did about 100 cases in 17 days. And he was just doing it by being able to move the system around the whole OR block. Go one further than that, and I won't talk too much about it now, but why does it have to stay in one hospital? Especially when we think about things like ASCs, or we start thinking about small private hospitals. If you make it mobile, we don't mean mobile just within the OR block. We mean 20 minutes, you can set it up. So you can get it between hospitals. Now you can start sharing these expensive assets and making sure that you get those high numbers. And that's how you crash the price of a procedure.
That's an interesting point, because as we get more digital, inevitably, there's going to be a divergence of the haves and have-nots.
Yes.
So we've got major metro areas, wealthy pockets, better educated people in those areas, generally speaking. Yeah. And then those are the hospitals that can afford the $1 million robot. Yeah. Yet the more rural areas, statistics show that healthcare quality there drops off precipitously. Yeah. And underrepresented areas around the globe, especially, but yeah, especially in the US. And so as we move into this digital age, is there going to be a divergence? And does CMR have a mission or a sensitivity to that? Of how do we show up in the underrepresented? Because most of the robots are in tier 1 hospitals right now. Yeah. And these changing centers of care also include the less sophisticated centers of care in underrepresented and rural areas. Yeah. Is that a pathway for this platform?
It absolutely is. And if you look at the founders, they weren't thinking about how do we take 10% of somebody's share in the US. That's just nonsense, right? That doesn't move the dial in healthcare. Where you move the dial in healthcare is when you come out into those secondary centers or into the high volume centers out in the rural areas. And to do that, there's several things that you have to do. One of those things is you might have to share an asset, because you know they might only operate on a Tuesday and a Thursday. So would you just leave it in a cupboard for Monday, Wednesday, Friday? That doesn't make sense. So that was a big appeal of why we tried to make Versius as it is, so it could be a shared asset. That's number one. The second thing is you have to make it so that it's simple to adopt. You've got to make it simple for the OR teams, and you've got to make it simple for the surgeons. Because if the learning curve is so long, that also becomes an elitist sport. So you've got to make it so that very quickly you could get on Versius and it would feel very comfortable. And the entire design of this was made that it just feels like laparoscopy with a robot. It feels quite different. If you look at the way that the angles of the arms come in, the ports, the camera view, it's all designed to mimic laparoscopy. And that's really so that you can transfer your laparoscopic skills into your robotic skills, and somewhere in between. You can have that whole grey area in between. I'll do a bit laparoscopic, And then I'll transfer a bit that's really important for the robotic. A key to doing that is that your ports have to be where you want your ports. And one of the keys of Versius is it doesn't dock to ports. It doesn't even care if the ports are there, to be honest, the way that it works. So that allows you freedom, this versatility. You put the ports where you want to put them. That's important because if I want to reach with a laparoscopic instrument, a standard lap instrument, I can reach. I take that out and now I insert a Versius instrument. It's an immediate flow between the two without having to put new ports in, without having to reposition the patient. It's really just allowing you then to bring the benefits of Versius to that part of the procedure if you want. Now, of course, we can do the whole procedure A to Z. But out in some centres, as you were saying quite rightly, the workflow and the way that they want to work, I take all the adhesions down lap because I can do that in 2 minutes. It's not a huge burden. Why would I waste my time on the robot doing that? And then I bring the robot in for that piece of it. And that's really one of the things we want to do. So it's about workflow. If you get that, you can go to somewhere like an ASC, because an ASC is about throughput, right? It's all about throughput. So you've got to be able to make it so that somebody could be taking the adhesions down next door. Okay, go get me the Versius. You roll the Versius in, they do their piece. They're preparing the next OR, Versius comes back in, and you get that flow between the ORs. I think that's what will enable the tier 2 hospitals, where they've not got a dedicated teaching robotic OR. And I think that will also allow it to come out to some of the smaller private hospitals or the ASCs. And that's, I think, really going to be important, because if we want to impact the majority of cases, you've got to go where the majority of cases are. And the second and or the final piece of that is it can't just be reserved for the big cancer operations. It has to start getting into the benign operations as well. And therefore, that's when you get your real volumes up. So, if you're reserving this for 30 cancer operations a year, yet you could be doing 230 cases, which is 30 and 200 benign, well, divide that cost over the whole 230. That's how, again, you crash the cost, but it has to be versatile. It has to be able to flow between the ORs and with the daily workflow that, say, an ASC would have.
So you bring up the word workflow a few times.
Yeah.
And you also brought up changing procedures.
Yeah.
Clinicians, surgeons are notorious for not wanting to do that, change their workflow, nor change their procedure. I learned this procedure 20 years ago. Now, wait a second. So one of the cardinal rules in medtech is don't change my procedure. Adoption, utilization, out the door. But what you're talking about is somewhat provocative. So first in doing this, are we prepared to, one, make the economic argument on it? Sure. But is the surgeon, he or she, going to sign up for that immediately, or do you foresee a learning curve or an adoption curve on that?
So what we don't want to do is put them on 2 learning curves. And that was really, again, when we were designing Versius and the training courses that go with Versius, what we don't want to do is have to make them rethink the procedure. It's how do you just make this like any other piece of kit in the OR? So you take your current procedure, you don't have to relearn that, and you do exactly what you would be doing, but you can use Versius. So I think if you take that whole piece of learning curve away, that makes the barrier a lot easier. I don't have to rethink my surgical training. I just take my current surgical training and now I just bring an instrument into it. And then the second thing about it was, how do we make it so that it's very easy to adopt? And everyone always thinks the surgeon immediately on that. It's actually the OR teams that are generally the bigger resistance when you're looking at adoption of a technology. If a nursing group don't want to adopt it, they'll make sure that the OR doesn't adopt it, right? You know it. So we try to do everything within our power to make that as simple as possible. From the controls to the way that this is collaborative robotics. If you can push an angle poised lamp around, you can set up the Versius arms. We tried to make the training as minimal as possible in terms of the actual technology. Let the technology just get out of the way. And I think we've accomplished that. We're going to do it even better with some of the new training tools, like the VR training tools, so that people can train at home. That's another one of the things. But I think, yeah, people don't like to change. So the less we change of their procedure and make it easier to introduce the technology, I think that's one of the barriers we'll be able to drop a little bit. And we're seeing it. We are seeing it. So
So you brought up two things as I wrap up this part here. You bring up two things. You bring up training.
Yep.
And so let's talk about that. And then also spitball for me, how many procedures have we got under our belt? And what were the provocative and surprising learnings in those first couple hundred, a couple thousand procedures that made you pause and maybe change a form factor or change an interface?
So let me take the second question first. So a lot of the learnings are that I think most med tech companies and companies will understand this, is that you can do all you want in the lab. When you go into the wild, there's just a lot of surprises. You know, things like cabling, or there's things like how people actually do their workflow, what they want to do, resistance sometimes to not want to do it the way that we would want to do it. So you learn all those things, so you have to then be flexible and say, does the system allow you to do things in a different way? So we learned a lot in the early days, in the first couple of hundred procedures. We learned a lot from that, and our engineers said, well, that's not how we did it in the lab. But I think one of the benefits is it's a fairly flexible system, so we could very easily flex around that. We've done officially out there, we only try and put out official numbers when we're guaranteed that we've done the numbers. So we just recently announced the 5,000 procedures, and so we're fairly far up the learning curve now. And I think that our education has helped in that. So we've been very fortunate to have a very forward-thinking chief medical officer who was very involved in laparoscopic training early on, and we've been working really hard to train people on Versius, not on surgery. That's one of the things we don't do, is we don't train them on surgery. We train them on Versius. And our original training has all been about time-based. You know, you do 10 hours of this and 10 hours of that. Well, some people in 50 hours don't get to the level they're supposed to be at. And some people in 2 hours get there. So one of the other things that we've really learned in this journey so far is that everyone's different. So we can't do any more time-based learning. We have to go to proficiency-based. So the entire shift of our education system is going to proficiency and metrics-based. Why is that? Well, one of the things is we don't want people saying, yeah, you're ready to use the Versius, because you put personalities in there, right? And that can be sometimes very political.
Especially with surgeons.
Especially with surgeons, and it can be. So instead, what we want to do is we want to make the data tell you when you're ready. And the data is the data. And proficiency-based, we're actually done a lot of work, and there's going to be some publications coming on how we're looking at proficiency-based training. And we really want to get people to say that the system will tell you, because it's a smart system, and the system will say, okay, you're ready now, and you can move on to the next phase. And that's really our next phase. And I think that's been a big learning in the last couple of years, where we see very different people come through on the system, some with incredible capabilities, and some people with less. You know, it just takes them longer to get used to it. And rather than treat everyone the same, we try and really tailor the education to their abilities, their needs, and their learning tempo. And I think that's been one of the big changes that we've made. Mm.
Is that a software platform that is informing the user and or the guidelines? And what's beyond the platform we see here? We've seen other surgical robotic companies release an entire suite of software platforms, software products, enabling the surgeon, showing proficiency of use, outcomes, registries. Is that in the works?
Yeah, so every system comes with what we call a VT, or a Versius trainer. And that's, it's a skills trainer. And it would give you, in the past, some metrics that come off that and tell you how much hand movement you did and things like that. Well, we've now linked that into the actual professional education training. So the VT is now going to be proficiency-based. And that's one of the things that we're going to release soon, is a proficiency-based Versius trainer. So the software in there will tell you how well you've been moving, how well you sutured, did you keep dropping the needles, all of these things. And we've been building a fairly extensive digital ecosystem for clinical cases, and we're slowly joining the whole thing up. So the Versius trainer will also talk to your app. So we have something called Versus Connect. And that's for the individual user who can claim their surgeries, claim their training, claim their demo boxes, and also claim their Versus trainer statistics. And the whole thing talks now. It's all connected. That's why we call it Versus Connect. And we start giving insights to the users about their training pathway, about their dry box pathway, and about their clinical pathway, how they're going up the learning curve on their clinical pathway. And that all feeds back in one app, which is called Versus Connect there. And then we have a whole series of other digital products coming, Teams apps for the OR team, and digital apps for our service teams to make sure that we're keeping the systems running healthy all the time, so we don't disrupt surgery. That's really important to us. So yeah, we've got a lot of digital products coming to build a fairly large digital ecosystem. And then you add on to that, there's just been changes in the world, right? It's 2023 almost, and you look at things like VR goggles and headsets. Well, why wouldn't we use that as well? So one of the problems of all of these robots is that you need that robot in the room with you if you want to train on it. Well, that means you've got to take whole teams to a training center to go and do that all the time. Wouldn't it be nice if I could sit in my kitchen at home and go into a VR world and actually learn how to use this robot? So one of the things that we've launched, it was about June this year, and that's rolling out everywhere, is that the nursing teams, they'll get a headset, they put it on, and they can physically interact in that VR world as if they had a Versus here. I think that's one of the game changers, where you can do education at mass. And the next step to that is, how do I give that same thing to the surgeons so that they can do their proficient VT training at home as well? And that's a future project that we're looking at, of how do we bring a Versus to somebody's home without having to stick $1 million robot in their house.